If you are into the mining sector, if you are into one of the primary industries like dairy or some agriculture, then naturally those supply chains are local and they're sizable and there are big players in them. And the jobs which are associated with those companies, with those industries, are also equally sizable, whether they are for local consumption or for the primary industries. Australia is a massive exporter to Apple. You have to be mentally prepared for it. Local experience, probably rightly or wrongly, counts for more. And to some degree you can understand it, because local experience lets you understand the nuances and the dynamics of this market. But if you're used to running global supply chains, regional supply chains, then it's not, that currency doesn't carry the same value as it does based on what you're likely to assume for yourself. So which city do you land in? How is the center of gravity of the companies that you ultimately want to work for, whether they're local or international? Where are they generally based? If it's the West Coast, as we said, has to be mining. If it's more corporate, more consumer driven, then the East Coast is where your bigger urban centers and population centers are. The headhunting industry here, the recruitment industry here is quite well developed. They are very professional. Within supply chain, there are a select few that cover the market very well, especially on the East Coast side of things. In fact, the more flexible you are, not to be in the top 3 cities, there's a good chance that there will be more demand for your kind of flexibility. So I have actually met more people, Jamil, who may have come even with those kind of initial plans, but they have chosen to stay back because what Australia offers overall as a lifestyle, as a quality of life equilibrium, it suits them. They prefer to stay.
Hello and welcome to another podcast on my channel. And recently in my coaching calls, or even from a lot of my followers on LinkedIn and YouTube, I've got a very common question that how can we migrate to Australia while keeping our supply chain careers intact? And I think it's a very natural question, because Australia, Canada, United States, and UK are one of those countries in the world where immigration is pretty high for economic reasons, for securing better passports and so on. So it's only natural to ask that question. And to talk about that, I've invited someone who is an extremely seasoned and experienced supply chain professional, an old-time friend of mine. We have both worked at Procter & Gamble many, many years ago. And he has himself migrated to Australia over the last couple of years. So he's in a perfect position to talk about this topic. So without further ado, I would like to welcome my friend Aamir Mehdi to this podcast. Hello, Aamir. How are you?
Hi, Jamil. I'm well, thank you. Very excited to be part of your podcast.
Excellent, Aamir. So Aamir, tell us a little bit about your supply chain career journey to my audience first.
Sure. I think I fell straight into supply chain right out of college. As you just mentioned, we crossed paths at Procter & Gamble. So that was sort of my start of my professional life. I came to P&G in Pakistan through the internship program. And then probably by accident landed in the supply chain function. And then since then, for the last about 2 decades, I've been sampling different roles around the world in different geographies. I've been lucky to work with some amazing organizations and people. I took a couple of segues in the name of broadening assignments in general management and strategy. But a large part of my career, I've been lucky to get exposure into different facets of the typical plan, source, make, deliver, and now the digital facet in the recent past. And at the same time, as I said, geographically, I got exposure to a wide range of countries, Middle East, Africa, Europe, Asia, and then Oceania sort of was my last bit before moving to Australia. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I've only ever worked in 3 companies. P&G was my starting. Then I moved on to a dairy giant called Fonterra. And then for the last almost 1 year, I've been working for a big Aussie conglomerate called the Reese Group.
Excellent, Aamir. So tell my viewers a little bit about your thought process on why Australia, why did you choose to migrate there? Just a little bit about the decision itself.
Sure. We landed in Australia more on the normal career trajectory. We did not choreograph a move to Australia per se. I was actually going to move to Melbourne with Fonterra as part of a global role. And this was happening just as COVID was finishing up and the world was opening up again. But like many people who have had international exposure, whether they are from the subcontinent or elsewhere, migrating to one of the more advanced economies was one of the bucket list items, if you like, and the typical countries like the ones you mentioned are the Commonwealth ones or the US. So we had been toying with the idea of at some point migrating to one of these countries and get that additional exposure. But Australia happened really within my career trajectory. We were quite happy about it because Australia is one of those places that gives you a British lifestyle, but in an American setting. It is big, it is wide open. It's a continental country. However, again, interestingly for me, I left Fonterra kind of midway through my move. Circumstances changed. Fonterra was going through some changes. I had been with them for 15 years, so I just thought it was a good time to move on. But we still decided to continue and move to Australia. Our other choices were staying in Singapore or moving back to Dubai. But I think largely driven by where we wanted to keep the family, where my kids were on their school education, but also then experiencing and establishing some local credentials in the Oceania region. It kind of came together quite nicely. I'm still new here, as I like to say. As it's not a very long time that I've spent here, but I was lucky to have exposure to Australia and New Zealand because of the company I was working for. They were very big in Oceania. It was a New Zealand-based company. So I think I had a bit of an advantage in terms of having an idea about the lifestyle, career prospects, the market itself. And then all of that came together and made the decision relatively easy to take that punt eventually. We took it a little bit late in our career journey, I would say, after 20 years or so. But I think that was just the right timing for us.
And for someone like myself, Aamir, who moved to Canada many years ago, and one of my, at least you can call it my research when I was looking at Canada, is that Canada benefits a lot from the US economy, right? So it's not as big of a country from an economic perspective as compared to the US, but it benefits a lot by being next to a huge economy like the United States. There is a very famous statistic that 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, and that has its impact on every single industry, and supply chain is no different, right? So, but when I think of Australia is, like you said, a continental country, very much on its own. How is the supply chain market there, and what kind of industries within supply chain are thriving more than others?
Sure. I think in the regard that you just mentioned, Australia is quite different from Canada. It does not have the benefit of being in the backyard of a major economy. Conversely, Australia, because of its sheer size and the peer group it has within the Southern Pacific region, it prides itself in being one of those big economies. But as you said, with 25 million people, there is big and then there is big. So when you look at the likes of US or China or even Japan, India, etc., it is not that major an economy. Having said that, if you look at metrics like per capita consumption, production, GDP, and so on, it is one of the OECD countries. So it is a sizable economy in its own right, especially given the population size. But as you come into Australia, you get, depending on where you're coming from, you have to put things in a little bit of perspective. So as I said, Australia thinks it's big, which it is when you compare it to the likes of New Zealand or the Pacific Islands. But as soon as you get even into Southeast Asia, you compare it to its next door neighbor of Indonesia, it's not that big. When you compare it to China or India, it appears even smaller in that sense. And if you look at Australia as an economy and then connecting it back to your supply chain question, it is an industrialized nation by definition, but a large part of its what it makes and consumes locally or sends out to the world, it's heavily dependent on natural resources. Like mining is the big sector here. And over time, in the last 2-3 decades, that industrialization pendulum has swung more towards relying on those local resources more rather than onshoring or those industries expanding. Obviously, it's a big consumer market in its geography, but you would see that it has chosen to rely heavily on wherever the free trade economy makes sense. So there's a lot of goods that would actually be coming into the country from outside, rather than you seeing local industry scaling up in the same fashion as you would see in developing markets. So naturally, that has a knock-on effect on what supply chains look like, right? So if you are into the mining sector, if you are into one of the primary industries like dairy or some agriculture, then naturally those supply chains are local and they're sizable and there are big players in them. And the jobs which are associated with those companies, with those industries, are also equally sizable, whether they are for local consumption or for the primary industries. Australia is a massive exporter too. So those are global supply chains in that regard. But when you compare to your basket of goods, if it is your typical grocery basket, or if you look at automobiles, or if you look at pharmaceuticals, then the trade balance is a little bit different. It is not a big local producer, and therefore you see a lot of supply chain jobs focused on sourcing. You see them in the space of S&OP planning and the likes. Of course, there are big distribution operations. It's a massive country. It's got 3 time zones on its own. And as the crow flies, from the east coast to the west, if you go from Perth to Sydney or Brisbane to Sydney, it's about a 5-6 hour journey. So similar to continental US or Canada, it's a very big country, east to west, north to south. So your local distribution jobs, whether the goods are locally produced or coming from outside, they are very much there. But not necessarily as an OEM. It does rely a little bit more on inbound goods than it does on things which are headed out. And then from there on, your lenses switch to which sector you're talking, within that sector, which companies you're talking, and so on. So yes, developed country, pretty much all the big companies are here. It is a big consumer market for all different companies. But in terms of the total consumers available, it's a fraction of, as the countries we were discussing. And therefore, the look, feel, and the scale of those jobs have to be put in that context. If you're especially comparing it to Northeast Asia or to Southeast Asia or to the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, excellent. And there's one question I want to ask you within this context, Aamir, because you, of course, also worked in Singapore before moving to Australia. How instrumental was your regional experience in you kind of maneuvering through the job market in Australia?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, if you ask me, Singapore, as you know, like Hong Kong or a few other major hub cities, is known for its regional presence of companies. Singapore itself is a very small market. Most people who are based out of there have regional briefs or larger than that. So when you look at your resume, when you look at your experience, and many times Asia Pacific is run out of Singapore or Hong Kong, and Australia is a part of it. So in your own mind, when you arrive, you think you've covered the market to some degree, and additional experience of other countries should be a bonus, should be a plus. That actually may not be the perspective of the market or the employers. They are quite keen on local experience. Again, I'm not saying nobody values it. Certainly, if you bring the right skill set and experience, there is value for it. But if you haven't done it in Australia, for a large majority of opportunities, that regional experience may not carry as much weight as you might think it should, or it does elsewhere in the world. So if you have done a regional role in Asia and you take that experience to Western Europe or US, it's likely to be recognized and put to good use. In Australia, that may or may not happen. You have to be mentally prepared for it. Local experience, probably rightly or wrongly, counts for more. And to some degree, you can understand it because local experience lets you understand the nuances and the dynamics of this market. But if you're used to running global supply chains, regional supply chains, then it's not, that currency doesn't carry the same value as it does based on what you're likely to assume for yourself.
Right, which I think is a very common challenge between Australia and Canada as well, because in Canada as well, if you go and apply for a job in a local Canadian company, you run into the same challenge that they are looking for a Canadian experience. And of course, when you are new in Canada, you take that very negatively as well, because like you have worked for years and years in other geographies, and supply chain skills are generally transferable. But then when you start working in the market, I'm sure Australia is no exception, you start realizing that okay, yes, there are some certain nuances of the market where local experience definitely has its value. So tell me, Amir, for someone who is either just about to land in Australia with an immigration in his hand, or they are already there looking for their first jobs, what are some of the useful tips based on your own experience you would like to share?
I think first and foremost, as we touched base on in the previous question, recalibrate your expectations. You've already alluded to the fact that Canada is similar. I would say New Zealand is a much smaller market, but to some degree that applies there as well. Do not assume, unless you're coming with a multinational or you're only going to target multinational company jobs, that your experience would be a one-to-one translation. Excuse me. That helps you manage expectations as you get into the job market, as you prepare for introductions, as you prepare for selling yourself, your profile. It saves you from the typical pitfall of disappointment. Also important to note that there are not many companies, multinationals I'm referring to, that would run their regional or global briefs from Australia. Even if Australia is part of a region or a business unit, there's a high chance that the headquarter for that region is sitting somewhere, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai, and so on. There are a few that would run regional roles because they are, location agnostic. It doesn't matter where they run from. But there are not very many of those, right? So if you talk your typical blue chip list of consumer companies like P&G, Unilever, Nestle, Mondelez, etc., they are not necessarily running regional hubs from here. So you have to integrate yourself or find yourself a foothold in the local market. So take yourself back to when you entered into a local market at an earlier stage of your career. That's the first one. The second one is you need to do some research, right? You need to have an idea of how different sectors are performing, where those jobs are located, how flexible you are. We talked about it being a big country similar to the US or China, but there is this one very big difference where other than the 5 big cities, there's a lot of wilderness in between, right? Yes, there are population centers in the rural areas, but they're very, very small. So which city do you land in? How is the center of gravity of the companies that you ultimately want to work for, whether they're local or international? Where are they generally based? If it's the West Coast, as we said, has to be mining. If it's more corporate, more consumer driven, then the East Coast is where your bigger urban centers and population centers are. Then the third one is, and I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit later as well, it's the value of networking is probably at a premium here. It's a small market, as we've established, relatively speaking, which means once you enter a sector, once you enter a company, you are essentially becoming a part of a group where everybody knows each other quite well. And therefore, knowing people, getting yourself introduced, understanding what they're working on, your typical networking initiatives, I think they are very useful. They are probably the primary vehicle that not only acquaints yourself with what the market is and where the opportunities might be, but they're also your primary vehicle for marketing yourself. That's how people will get to know you. The headhunting industry here, the recruitment industry here is quite well developed. They are very professional. Within supply chain, there are a select few that cover the market very well, especially on the East Coast side of things. Finding people, unlocking that network effect is quite crucial. So plan for those key building blocks, and I think from there on it becomes easier.
Excellent. And you just touched on this briefly, Amir, but let me ask you this for people who are not very much familiar with the Australian geography, because one of the things we see in a lot of other countries as well, that supply chain jobs, although a country may have several cities, but supply chain jobs, just because of the nature of warehousing, the cost of real estate, manufacturing reliance of the country itself, the supply chain jobs queue is typically tilted more towards the mega cities. Like, for example, once again, if I were to use the Canadian analogy, while Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Calgary are like the big four cities. But I would say the vast majority of jobs are centered in Toronto, just because it's kind of the warehousing hub geographically, the way the population is set up. It makes a lot of sense to base a lot of jobs there. Tell me a little bit about Australia, because you mentioned that mining jobs are in the west. So if someone is moving to Perth, should they be targeting more the natural resources industry, and Sydney and Melbourne are more on the consumer goods? So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think, in my own opinion, this is more driven by your typical normal distribution of population, Jamil. Yes, mining, because of where the mining resources are, it is in the Western Australian state much more than it is on the eastern seaboard. But the bigger population centers, the top three, which is Greater Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, they happen to be on the East Coast. It depends a little bit also what level of job you're securing, how young or old you are within your career trajectory. If you're looking for, let's say, an early stage vacancy, let's say a distribution center manager or a transport logistics manager, you don't necessarily have to be in one of the big hubs, because the sheer size of this country, as I talked earlier, mandates that many companies would have hubs or some kind of operation across the urban centers, and they will give good coverage to all the states. That means for people who are relatively young, they're still at an early stage, there is no harm in trying your luck where the clutter might be less. The likes of Adelaide, the likes of Perth, or even on the eastern side, if you think of Newcastle, or up the eastern coast, north of Newcastle, Brisbane, and further up, there would be operations. There's a little bit of research that would help you understand what kind of companies may have their operations set up there. In fact, the more flexible you are, not to be in the top three cities, there's a good chance that there will be more demand for your kind of flexibility. So I think that's worthwhile if you can offer it. Naturally, if you have already crossed that middle stage of your career, you're above 10, 15 years of experience, you are vying for more senior roles. And this is where the seniority of the roles either is dependent, as you said, in terms of where the center of gravity is, where their bigger operations are, if you are on the front line, or where the HQs are, because now you're talking about leadership and corporate and so on. And this is where Sydney and Melbourne kind of stand out a little bit more, followed by, again, in decreasing order of magnitude, with Brisbane and Adelaide. Perth is unique because that's where most of Australia's mining, which is massive. If you read some numbers about it, it's sort of the big city hub on the western side. So Perth, for those sectors, is bigger than all the others. But on average, for the other companies, Perth is a smaller city. So you have to, when you're picking, just see where you are on that trajectory, how flexible you are, what your research tells you in terms of the sectors you're going to target. And if you are flexible, it'll help. And then you can always work your way up, as your career progresses. Sydney is the biggest city in terms of business activity, in terms of where most of the headquarters are. Melbourne is not much far behind. But when you compare it to Toronto, Vancouver, or the cities that you mentioned in Canada, I think one different thing here is because Australia is such a big exporter of goods as well. The points of entry into the country are not restricted to one or two cities. So Adelaide's port does do a lot. Interestingly, New Zealand does the same. Yes, Auckland is the big city, but all across their eastern coast, the likes of Tauranga and Christchurch, and then all the way, down to the South Island even, you can find opportunities. They're just probably different depending on the size of the business, the scale of the job, and so on and so forth. So, and everybody wants to come to Sydney and Melbourne, right? Because that's where most opportunity would be. So if you play it smart and you have a little bit of luck on your side, you can use the variables to your advantage. This is not to say that Sydney and Melbourne is impossible, not at all. They are the places where the big opportunities or the largest number of opportunities would come. But you can probably even the spread out a little bit better.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Aamir, because I think you are a perfect person to ask this because you have worked in multiple geographies. And this is also a topic which I cover a lot on my channel. In fact, one of the books I've been actively talking about recently is called The Culture Map, which really helps people understand the differences between different cultures of people from different parts of the world. And because you have worked in South Asia, you have worked in the Middle East, you have worked in Singapore, and you have also worked for American company and for a New Zealand based company. What are some of the cultural nuances or things that people need to be aware of culturally as they are planning to maneuver their career into Australia? So tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, I personally found Australia to be one of the most relaxed places of all the places I've lived and worked in. I think people here are amazing. They are very welcoming. It is a country that has built its population on a very successful immigration regime. So it welcomes, and I'm talking in general terms, right? Not the odd incident here or there. They're very welcoming, whether it's your own diaspora that you go and connect back with, or whether it's the locals that you eventually interact with, depending on wherever you are. I found people to be relaxed, easygoing, welcoming. They love to socialize. They do not shy away from striking a conversation. Depending on where you are in places like Asia, Middle East, you can have language barriers, you can have cultural sensitivities that you alluded to. I think Australia is one of the most relaxed places in that sense, as I've found. There is obviously a general expectation that you will reciprocate the warmth that you receive. When people are welcoming, when they are kind, when they do want to talk to you, and especially if you come from outside and you come across people who may not have had that exposure, they are fascinated. They want to talk more about it. It's good to as part of your integration to reciprocate that warmth. That's again my opinion. There is obviously an expectation that you would be very transparent. They would take you most things on face value, which the flip side of which is if you have oversold yourself, if you have been quoting stuff that are not part of your credentials, if you have exaggerated them beyond a certain point, that may not leave a lasting impression. It is a closed ecosystem in many ways. It is a small world in many ways. Sorry. So I think it's very important to go by that time-tested value of do what's right, be honest, be yourself. Perseverance is important because it's a welfare state, because it has a relaxed environment in general. Things do not move at the pace which you might be used to. People do balance their quality of life. The concept of work-life balance, some might argue, that it gets stretched even more than it should be. But that's because they put a premium on it, right? And they value it. And I think there is value in that for anybody who becomes a part of it. And also, I think it's important to move at pace of the system that you eventually become a part of. So they are keen to learn. They are keen to get better. But this is not a developing market pace that you might be used to. You will not see people putting in, burning the midnight oil, so to say, to get the job done. You have to meet expectations. Naturally, you have to adjust your expectations we talked about earlier, your own personal ones. You have to recalibrate them. But culturally, I don't think you would follow, you would kind of run into any major issues. Language, especially for the English-speaking world, which is probably very global now, that's an added benefit as you arrive in Australia. You don't have that issue. You may need to learn a little bit of slang. You may need to get used to the accents, but that's anywhere. But I think of all the places I have been privileged to live in, this has been the natural transition, not just for me, but even for the family and a few other friends I've talked to.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think to learn the Australian slang, probably watching the game of cricket is probably the best way to go about it, right? Because I have learned a lot of Australian slang while growing up as a cricket fan in Pakistan. So
Yeah. No, that helps, but you need to adapt to, for example, if you live in Melbourne, footy is the big sport, cricket is not. Although you are in the home city of MCG, so there are many ways to learn the slang, and they are very happy to teach you if you show interest. And there are times when you will not understand anything in a conversation, but just persevere, and you'll get there.
yeah, and I think there's one thing I want to touch on, Amir, which you mentioned, such an important point, but often people tend to ignore it because I was actually coaching someone recently, and this person did a very smart job at looking at what was required in a specific job market and almost like modified some of the pointers on his resume based on, you taking some help from Chat GPT and so on. But my advice to that person was never do that, because you have to be yourself. Because in these markets, and I think you just reaffirmed my point about Australia as well, you have to be authentic, and you have to stay away from making up things on your resume which you haven't done. Because if you are exposed, then you lose the most important aspect of your personality, which is your integrity and trust. So whenever you are putting something in your resume, of course you can modify your resume based on the job you are applying for, and you can use keywords which are used in the keyword in the job description. But don't try to mention things which you haven't done, because if they go deeper in a job interview on those points, and if you are unable to give sufficient answers, that can backfire like nothing else. So always stay away from fabricating things on your resume or talking about things that you have not done. So thanks a lot for mentioning this, Aamir. Now, one as we are coming towards some of my last questions here, Aamir. Um, One question which I get a lot, and I think this is once again a question that is asked to immigrants in all sorts of countries around the world, is once someone has gotten their Australian passport and their immigration is done, um, and keeping this in the context of a supply chain career, is it advisable to stay back or move to, let's say, the tax-free havens like Middle East and so on? Whenever I am asked this question, my answer is that it's all very, very circumstantial. Depends on your personal situation. But I just wanted to get your perspective as well on this.
No, I think your advice in general is I fully agree with it. Uh, no two cases are the same. It heavily depends on your circumstances, and even more so on your aspirations and where you are on your journey. Uh, if you have seen the world, and you've traveled the world, and you've done roles everywhere, and you've come to Australia, we earlier talked about recalibrating your expectations, that things are different here, it's a different kind of market. But you have to remember what are the reasons that you moved here, for. Your reasons to stay might be linked to those reasons to move as well. I think people who come to Australia, and I'm again maybe still in early days of our move. You will find two sets of people who've come in very young, whose main objective was immigration, and a job was a way to just pass that period, and they cannot wait to get out. But they have a very different reason to believe in terms of where they want to be eventually, and it's a stepping stone for them. I have actually met more people, Jamil, who may have come even with those kind of initial plans, but they have chosen to stay back because what Australia offers overall as a lifestyle, as a quality of life equilibrium, it suits them. They prefer to stay. The trick here is when you say, I want to move, what is driving that move? While a lot of global experience may not carry as much weight as you come to Australia, the inverse can also be true, where if you have been in this market for 10, 15 years, you may have missed the boat where some of your other peers may have hopped from one job to another and gotten exposure into more action-oriented markets, if I can use that term. And they may seem to have jumped ahead in the queue of growth. So that's where it needs to be an apples to apples comparison. I would say if you have come to Australia, you have naturalized, you've got local experience, but you haven't gotten enough international exposure, that's a very good reason to try your luck once again out there in the world. Because as good as Australia is, and its people and its market and everything, and it punches above its weight on the world stage, it is still a small market, relatively speaking. So it all depends on what your aspirations are. Where do you see your career in the long term? And inversely, if you have done the exciting things elsewhere, I'm not saying Australia won't be exciting. You can always find there's some amazing companies here which are operating at massive scale and would offer tremendous opportunities for growth. Or if you're that lucky small percentage where you're sitting in Australia, but you're looking after a region, then that's probably a best of both worlds. But 100%, it is circumstances and ambition driven, and no two cases are the same. When you reach that stage, if you're conflicted, if you're concerned, get some advice, talk to people who have done that journey in both directions, and maybe they can give you some first-hand knowledge. but ultimately it's a decision based on what you want rather than what's that magic recipe of when should I leave or when should I come back. So I think it's a different answer for different individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree more because it's very circumstantial, Amir. Thanks for sharing that perspective. And one of the other questions, which I think you once again are an ideal person to ask, is that um, recently I've been getting some of these questions as well about immigration to New Zealand as well, right? How are these two markets? I know New Zealand is a much smaller country, but there might be pockets where some of the industries are bigger there. So based on your experience also, like working with a company like Fonterra, which is one of the biggest employers in New Zealand, how do you compare the supply chain job markets between Australia and New Zealand?
uh, at best it's the same ratio as the populations, so 1:5, 1:6, if you like. It's a very generalized statistic. New Zealand is a much bigger primary industry, where in their case the primary industries revolve around dairy, meat, forestry, fishing. So that's where they bulk of their volume. They are the massive exporter of those resources to the whole world. So if you're into one of those sectors, if you're working with one of those companies, whether it's kiwi fruit, whether it's milk, whether it's the fishery area, you might find yourself to be a very big fish in a small pond within the New Zealand context. It is a very small market, right? We're talking 5 million people there or thereabouts. In fact, we used to joke that when I was in Fonterra in my early days, at that time they used to say we have 4 million people and 5 million cows and 7 million sheep. So that should tell you what is their reliance on those industries. Once again, it might provide people a jumping board if they find the Australian market or the Australian landscape a bit cluttered. The good thing between these two countries is if you are a naturalized citizen in one or the other, it's essentially a free market movement. So, if you're a Kiwi, you can come and work in Australia and vice versa. You do not require any additional visas or work rights or something like that. But between the two, opportunities would certainly be numerically and weighted more towards Australia. There are a lot of people who would naturalize in New Zealand and very quickly move to Australia for that reason. It is the bigger brother in that balance of power, if you like. But New Zealand is, again, it's one of those countries which does very well on the world stage, right? It's got very passionate people. They like to, I've worked for the company, so I have a little bit of a bias. If you find yourself in one of those sectors, New Zealand is an amazing place again to live. It's even more welcoming than Australia in some regards. But it is equally less, the amount of action you will see there will be very different scale-wise, the more further away you move in that direction.
Right. And I mean, I know this is a question going a little bit in the tangent, but is the naturalization process and the duration similar to Australia, or is it faster? Is it slower?
Good question. I know these things keep changing, and there's a lot in the news. And usually a consultant or an agent can advise you on what is the latest picture. From what I have heard, it depends a little bit on what is the arrangement as you have arrived. So New Zealand, I believe, used to be faster, but during COVID, their backlog has gone up quite a bit. But I have to put the disclaimer: this is not official advice. Check with experts, check with the websites, check with the relevant departments. I would think, all else being equal, Australia is probably a bit more streamlined in the recent past compared to New Zealand. And then visa, as you know, is not just the processing. It's also, how many positions are open in certain categories, how many visas are being given. There is a lot of focus on immigration, and I'm sure we heard a lot about Canada as well, Jamil, recently, the sentiment, anti-immigration sentiment and whatnot. So without going into the politics of it, I think Australia and New Zealand are not immune to that either. New Zealand is a little bit more neutral in that regard. The extreme views are a bit less. But if you come with in the right category, and when I say in the right category, meaning you have the right to work, I think once that process gets going, Australia these days, I believe, is a little bit easier and faster. New Zealand used to be, But my friends have told me recently that they are running a massive backlog since COVID.
Got you. Okay, excellent. I think this is helpful, Amir. Thanks for sharing that. And my last question to you is something which I ask anytime I invite someone with the kind of experience you have, more than 20 years in supply chain, because I think this question sometimes opens up a lot of $1 million tips for people to take away from. So what would be an advice you would like to give to your 25-year-old self?
Um, I think hindsight is a beautiful thing, right? It's always 2020, and I would have so much to say if I could talk to my 25-year-old self. But purely staying in the career and the kind of topics we have been discussing, I would probably worry a little bit less about the here and now, like we used to, about our roles, of our jobs, of our things like promotions and career journey at that early stage. I would probably redirect that attention and that focus. My advice would be to build the skills you need. If your personal circumstances allow, then raise your hand for opportunities that most people are not going for, whether they are geographically oriented, whether they are roles which look less attractive, whether they are skills which require you to take time off, study, and come back. I think, if anything, the last decade has proven to us that people are running out of relevance of their skills faster than they thought maybe a decade ago. Digital has completely changed the name of the game. And we have spent a lot of time, I have spent a lot of time in my past focusing on the short term, focusing on the immediate next steps. They are important. Obviously, when you work in the corporate culture, you want to get that progress. That's a yardstick for you to know where you're headed. But I would probably focus much more on focusing, sort of the skills of the future. I would focus more on where do I want to be. We always ask this question of where do you want to be in 5 years, 10 years, and we would usually wing the answers, just say something, or say something really, completely preposterous. But really, if you put some thought into it, you can curate your career a little bit better. You will still have to rely on luck and opportunities and whatnot. If you want to be in places where immigration is important to you, a second citizenship is important to you, I would say do it sooner than later if you can. But if there's a choice between an immigration and a career, I'm a good example. I think I'm an example of where I always picked career versus that route, and I have not had any regrets. So I would still probably give that same advice. And then final one I would say is I thought I grossly underestimated the value of networking, knowing people, asking the question, asking for help. In the worst case scenario, you would not get an answer or a no. But in my experience, that is so rare that you will surprise yourself. So, getting to know people, getting in the know, making that effort. I see leaders right now in my peer group who have done far better than other peers when they focused on the people aspect of their journey, right? Whether it's one above, one below, or sideways. Most probably that's what I would say, Jamil, to my 25-year-old self. Take less tension and redirect that energy to a little bit of a plan.
Excellent. No, I think those are all very, very useful points. And I always ask this question, like I said, because the majority of the viewers on my channel are in that early mid-career stage. So they can take a lot of advantage from our experiences, our mistakes.
Yeah.
So it's always helpful to share that advice. So thanks for doing that, Aamir. I think I'm coming to the end of this podcast, Aamir. Really, once again, thanks a lot for coming on my show. I think you have shared some very useful pieces of information where any supply chain professionals who is maneuvering his or her career into Australia or planning to move there anytime soon, I think this podcast is going to be super helpful for all those audience. So once again, thanks for taking the time. I know it's late in the night in Australia right now, so thanks for staying late for this. I really appreciate your time, and let's stay in touch.
No, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it too, Jamil. We'll talk soon again.